Okay, so we are going to do a mini lecture on the collapse of communism. The outline for this is posted to Portals under the Notes folder. So it's going to be a little shorter than our normal classroom lectures, but I'm sure you won't mind that too much. So our topic is, how did communism collapse? In class, we've been studying the rise and fall of the Berlin Wall, the ways in which that really came to symbolize the collapse of communism. But when the wall comes down, it's not the total end of the Soviet Union. A really important figure in the collapse of communism, the end of the Soviet Union, is Mikhail Gorbachev. This is Gorbachev. Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union in 1985. He was a lot different than many of the other Soviet leaders that Americans had encountered, right? Like Stalin and Khrushchev. Gorbachev was the youngest member of the political elite in the Soviet Union, sort of the top tier. Many of those older Soviet leaders were in their 70s and 80s, and Gorbachev was relatively young. He was 54 when he became the leader of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev joined the Communist Party when he was in college and really worked his way up through the ranks. And Gorbachev was not only a lot younger, but he was also a lot more stylish and a lot more modern than most of those other Soviet leaders. So Americans seemed a lot more comfortable with Gorbachev than with his predecessors. This was perhaps best summed up by his relationship with President Ronald Reagan. Right? So despite these tensions between the US and the Soviet Union, Gorbachev was able to develop a close personal relationship with Ronald Reagan, which in a lot of ways came to symbolize the thawing of the tensions between the two countries. One of the reasons that communism's going to collapse has to do with pressure from outside of the Soviet Union, pressure from its satellite countries. We're talking about, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, East Germany. In Poland, there was a growing and eventually quite large anti-communist labor union called Solidarity. 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 And this growing anti-communist labor union kept pushing for more political and religious freedom. At its height, 25%, a full quarter of the Polish population, belonged to this anti-communist group. And no amount of arrests or crackdowns from the communist government seemed to have any impact on its popularity. So Solidarity is probably the best example of these anti-communist groups, but they popped up in other satellite countries as well. In East Germany, you of course had the Berlin Wall and the wall in between East Germany, West Germany, along the German-German border. And people in East Germany kept trying to escape. Right? We saw that in the documentary that we watched. As a result of these escapes, right, the famous leap to freedom here, one of the very first escape attempts, as a result of all these people trying to escape, in order to keep them from leaving, East Germany was spending almost $500 million every single year trying to upgrade and maintain the wall. Basically, the wall was bankrupting East Germany. And East Germany was one of the most prosperous of the Soviet satellite countries. So if East Germany is supposed to be sort of the model country of what it's like to be a Soviet satellite, it's not a very good model, right? It's bankrupting itself trying to keep its people in. Two other satellites that were putting pressure on the Soviets were Hungary and Czechoslovakia. In those countries, they had opened up their borders to the West, which allowed East Germans and their own citizens to start to escape and to get to Western countries. This leads Gorbachev to introduce some new policies. And so there's two major policies that he introduces that have a huge impact on the fall of the Soviet Union. The first one was called Glasnost, which means openness in Russian. And basically the idea of Glasnost was that Gorbachev wanted to provide more freedom for the Russian people. And so even though they still didn't have full freedom of the press or full freedom of speech, they could write and say and criticize a lot more than they had been allowed to do in the past. And that gave them the opportunity to complain, to say that there are a lot of things happening that we don't like and we want to see changes. And this policy applied not only to Russia, but to the satellite countries as well. The second major policy that Gorbachev introduced was perestroika, which means restructuring. And this was an economic policy. Rather than having a complete command economy with the government in charge of all economic decisions, Gorbachev introduces perestroika. He restructures Russia's economy to allow for some, not total, but some private ownership of businesses. And so rather than having a total command economy, Russia starts to move to more of a mixed economy. It's still mostly command, but with perestroika, Gorbachev starts to allow a little bit of market economy in there as well. While he's in power, Gorbachev decides, with as many problems as the Soviet satellite countries are having, he wanted to give those satellites more independence. He wanted to focus on the problems inside of Russia. So he allowed Poland to have free elections, no interference. And when they did that, Poland elected a non-communist government, right? The first time that a Soviet satellite had basically thrown off communism. Furthermore, he let some satellite countries like Czechoslovakia and Hungary to open their borders without any penalty. No previous Soviet leader had allowed these satellite countries to do that. They had always prevented it, right? Because they didn't want people to leave. And you can see from the picture behind there, right? I mean, look at the cars that are just lined up to get out once they're allowed to leave. Gorbachev gives these satellites the independence to do that, and he doesn't send in the Soviet military to stop it from happening. The last major area I want to talk about is the impact of those policies. One we've already talked about. Poland, when given the option, selected a non-communist government. Given a true free election, the Polish people threw off communist rule and established a non-communist government. In East Germany, when East German officials announced that they're going to open the wall comes down almost overnight, right? The famous pictures of the crowds at the wall chipping away with sledgehammers and pretty much tearing down this visible symbol of division. And within a year, Germany had reunified under a non-communist government. One by one, the other satellites dropped their communist governments and elected non-communists. And in most cases, that transition was fairly peaceful. As more and more satellites fell away from the Soviet Union and declared their independence from the Soviet Union, it was just a matter of time before the Soviet Union itself was officially disbanded. In 1991, right at the end of 91, the Soviet Union disbands and the Cold War was officially over.